Welcome, many and everyone, to this session of the 7th edition of the Plural Positivity World Conference. This session is presented by Shashkes, covering important and sensitive topics including PTSD, trauma, addiction, kink. Please remember to prioritize your self-care during this session. You're encouraged to take breaks whenever needed and honor your collective emotional well-being. If you have questions for the presenter, please share them under the Questions tab so they can be addressed during the live Q&A. Afterward, we warmly invite you to visit this presenter's booth, where you'll find helpful PDFs and additional free resources. Now, without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our wonderful presenter to you all. Here is Shashkes.
Welcome, everyone, to the Neuroscience of Plurality, Theory, Innovative Technology, and Practical Tools to Increase Internal Harmony. Before we start, I want to give a few trigger warnings. We are going to be talking about trauma, PTSD, and dissociation, mostly from the neuroscience perspective, but that can still be very triggering. So if you feel triggered, please take care of yourself. You can pause at any moment. This is being recorded, and you can come back whenever you feel settled. A little bit about us as a system. I was asked to describe what we look like. We're white, assigned female at birth, slightly shaved head with long hair too, very slim. I go by the name of Shashkes. We are currently 3 full fronters in the system. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I consider myself a movement chauvinist, meaning I think we have a brain because we have the ability to move in 3D space. The other 2 members of our system currently are Sarit. We consider her as probably the original of the system, but also got dissociated very early on in life. And we can talk a bit more about how we brought her back later in the lecture. And Yeled identifies as transgender, prefers he pronouns, and he's an eco-entrepreneur. He's also what we consider a synthetic symbiotic part, and I'll talk about that more later. We have links you can look at. So really asked for people to support her attempt to pressure pharmaceutical companies to make vegan birth control pills. So you can please click on that if you want to support her. So let's start with the brain. The brain is probably the most complex machinery that we know of. We have 86 billion neurons connected to each other, and we'll talk exactly about the hierarchies, but just think about this for a moment, the amount of complexity that the brain has. And I think from the perspective of a plural, we might feel that sometimes, but it's just a number that is almost incomprehensible. What does the brain do? And in this lecture, I'm going to be focused a lot on the predictive coding framework. For me, when I studied cognitive neuroscience, this was what really opened my eyes. It was the framework that I felt explained the most around both data and the scientific experiments that we see, but also the subjective experience that I have being part of this brain or being a byproduct of this brain. So the brain doesn't have access to anything in the outside world. It only has access to information coming from the senses going through the spine. But it somehow needs to understand what's going out there and create a model of that. And that's what basically predictive coding is all about. How does the brain create this model, and also why? So there's a really, really interesting principle that's called the free energy principle that is part of this framework, which basically looks at us as the amount of possible states we can be in as an organism. We said we had 86 billion neurons, but they can't all fire together. That would, kill us. We'd get epilepsy. They can't all not fire together. That, we die. So there's very specific states that even the brain can be in for us to continue to stay alive. And of course, these brain states then influence our bodily states. So the free energy principle basically says that we need to minimize these states to states that will continue and sustain us as a living organism. And the way the brain actually sustains these states is by creating a model that combines both the present information coming from the senses, but also the past information, which we call biases or priors. And we consider the brain as doing something akin to Bayesian statistics, and we'll see an example of it later. But just so you understand, we're never actually fully in the present. There's always a past component to our experience. And a metaphor that I like to give is that if you're imagining being actually on a beach with so many sand around you, The sand is like the sensory input that we're getting. It's very noisy and there's so much of it. So to make sense of all the sensory input, your brain uses past knowledge that it has gained, past patterns, and creates a type of bucket or many different buckets, and basically tries to fit the sand into different buckets. So your perception is actually a very active, creative process. It's not something that's just passive. And I want to give a experiential example that will actually help you feel this and understand what it means to have priors. So this is called the Margaret Thatcher experiment, and we see two photos of Margaret Thatcher upside down, and I'm now going to flip these photos around, and whoa, I'm assuming most of you are seeing the photo on the left to be a lot more weird and warped than it was before. So I can go back again on the upside down. You don't really see a difference between the photos. And with the right side up, suddenly there's a very big difference between the left and right photo. Why is that? Well, we as humans, we have many, many experiences seeing faces that are right side up. In fact, it might be even coded into us, and we might be born into this preferential identification and following and tracking of upright faces. We do not have the same amount of experience and past knowledge of upside down faces. So our bucket of right side up faces is much more detailed, which causes our perception to be much more detailed. And we can really see the differences. A little bit about how this works in the brain. We basically have two different sets of neurons. One set of neurons are actually bringing the information from the senses. Again, like I said, through we have the spine, and then we go into the thalamus, and we'll talk more about the exact hierarchies later. But there's one part of the neurons are taking information and sending them upwards, and the other part of the neurons are actually sending information downwards and actually turning off the neurons. So if these top-down information, top-down neurons can actually understand and predict the activity of the bottom-up neurons, they will actually shut them off. And the only information that propagates from one area to the brain to another is actually what was not predicted, what is a surprise. So surprisal, sometimes called prediction error, that is the currency of the brain. That is what moves between one part of the brain to the other. That is what creates plasticity, what creates learning. So we're going to go through a lot of brain areas. You don't need to remember all of them, and you can always go back and review them. But I want you to understand that the brain is really built in layers. We have this deeper limbic system that also from an evolutionary perspective is older. We have the thalamus, which, as I said, gets all the information that comes from the spine and then starts distributing it. So it's sort of like a very central low-level hub. We then have all these like little glands, like the pituitary gland, hypothalamus, pineal gland. They are actually controlling the hormones in our body, from sleep to the sex hormones. So there's a connection between the brain and the body. And then we have the amygdala, sort of considered the fear center of the brain, the warning center, and we'll talk about that a lot because that obviously has big implications for trauma and in general for life. Then we have the hippocampus. So the way I sort of think about the hippocampus is a bit like if you have somebody in your friend group that's like a really good connector and networker, likes to bring people together and sort of connect everyone, that's a bit the hippocampus. And we say it's implicated in memory because that's what it gets. It gets all the different information from the thalamus and then starts connecting it to different places in the cortex. And this is very important to understand, I think, systems. The hippocampus has a very important part there in separating memory into different networks. And we'll see more about what research says about that soon. The cerebellum is the back part of the brain. Within the predictive coding theory, it's seen as the ability to make very fast last-minute adjustments based on prediction error. So if you have a prediction that something's going to happen and you're going to do something, but really last minute, there's some changes that need to happen. That's what will happen in the cerebellum. And of course, I actually forgot the midbrain and brainstem, which is where the information comes from. We're very low-level predictions and control of things like even your breathing happen. So this is the deeper part of the brain. And a very important part that we're going to speak about a lot is called the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia is a bit like the door person or the gatekeeper. When it comes to create actions, we can have multiple processing we can have multiple processing in various parts of the brain that are happening all the time, except when we're actually going to do an action, right? When we need to do something, all these different processes need to actually narrow down to one thing. And without that, we get very, problematic situation of, if your muscles are going to twitch in one way and the other way, you're not going to be able to move. And this is actually what happens in Parkinson. That's a basal ganglia disorder because dopamine neurons are dying. So the basal ganglia is really like a gatekeeper. It keeps everything tonically shut down unless one of these different predictions wins out. And we'll talk about that a bit more. But just remember, the basal ganglia is a very important part in our brain. We then are going to the cortex. So in the cortex, we have these separate areas that first predict and process different sensory modalities. Our visual cortex is in the back. It's very, very strong and powerful. I keep telling people it's like the GPU of computers. And we'll see why connecting to that visual processing can be very helpful when you're trying to deal with trauma, trying to deal with internal system communications. We have auditory processing on the side of our brain, and somatic, which is like the sensory and perception, as well as things like pressure and internal proprioception are in the somatic cortexes. And then we start like bringing more of the information together into the prefrontal cortex, where really that's where all the information comes together, is able to predict these long-term predictions, and more abstractions and more parts of interacting with reality that is unique to humans. The prefrontal cortex is much larger in humans than any other animal. Another part of the brain that is sort of hidden, and we see this on the bottom, if you peel part of the cortex, is still considered a cortex because it has the same structure of these neurons, and that's the insula cortex. So the insula cortex is, I have a theory about it, so I'll give you my theory and what we actually know. We know it's considered to sort of body proprioception, blood, heart rate, but also things like disgust and emotional processing in some ways. So the way I actually think of the insula cortex is it might be doing a layer processing that is about the liquid and non-Newtonian fluid dynamics that we have, again, as a physical embodied system. Keep that in mind. My theory may be accurate, maybe not. So one thing that I wanted to just say about the slide I showed before with the prediction error units, this seems to be a core principle of the brain. It might be shown in different ways in the actual organism and how the neurons are organized in the different parts of the brain. In the cortex, we have these pyramid cells. In the cerebellum, we have a slightly different structure. In these deep brain structures, we also have different neurons. But the general principle of only prediction error being moving around, and that is the one thing the brain is trying to actually turn off and minimize to actually have a model of what's creating its sensory perception. That is a general organizing principle of the brain. A little bit I wanted to talk about the other areas of the brain that are specifically about speech. We have Broca's area with production of speech, Wernicke's area and understanding speech, and then of course there's motor areas, like we need to actually move this mouth and tongue, and so many muscles are involved with actual speech. And we're going to talk about that because I think that can also be quite helpful in internal system communication, to understand how we can make use of these parts of our brain. Okay, so within this predictive coding framework, what is agency? What is a minimal self? And I would consider that, and not just me, but also in the literature, agency is the ability to predict your own movements, to predict your own state of this physical system. And when we come to a minimal self, there were some very, very interesting papers out there and experiments around this. But basically, the best top-down explanation of different sensory inputs is that they are coming from a singular thing, right? We're getting sensations from our hands and body and stomach and our perception and internal ear sensation. All this gets feedback loops because of our movement ability from the motor cortex that is actually creating these movements. And the best explanation is that these things are coming from this one organism. Now, it's very plastic, this minimal self. We can see in some experiments like the rubber hand illusion, where you put a rubber hand in front of somebody and you touch that at the same time that you touch their real hand. Many people, not everybody, and this would be a very interesting experiment to do with plurals and not, but many people do feel very fast that this hand is actually theirs, and you can see the experimenter can then come and squash it, this rubber hand, with a hammer. You can really see their blood pressure go up, their heart rate. So this is on a very low level somatic experience. Your brain is deciding this rubber hand is part of your body. But this also happens to us on a daily basis. Every tool that we use, if we drive cars, we wear clothes, our minimal self can expand to that. So part of this minimal self is, of course, this body map that we have, and we have a few different body maps in our brain, both in our sensory cortex and then also in our motor cortex. So the input, where the senses are coming, and then the motor cortex is where we get the output of the movements. And we also have one in the cerebellum that I'm not showing here. But what's very interesting is that this map of our body is developed based on how we were in the uterus, which makes sense because the brain is starting to get all these senses from the body while it's in the uterus already in this fetal position. So you can see in the map, the hand is very close to the head, the feet are very close to the genitals, because that is just the position that we're in and how we're like moving around in the womb. So that's something to understand about our mapping of the body, and we'll see how that relates to plurality. Now, as we start developing, a very important part of our brain is the mirror system. Now, we see this in very not friendly experiments with monkeys, but also in more advanced neuroimaging. But basically, we have sets of neurons, especially in our motor area, that will respond the same way whether we're seeing an action or if we're doing an action. And there's a lot of research that this is really the basic, not just of motor learning and mimicking, but also of empathy and of even building our understanding of what we are as we develop by being able to mimic people, especially our caregivers. Okay, we're going to start to get into what is trauma and how, and I'm not saying that, all plural systems come from trauma. I think there could be other avenues potentially, but there definitely seems to be a strong correlation. So I think it's important to understand what happens to the brain in trauma, specific trauma of loss of agency, right? When your brain stops being able to predict its own state of the body. And this can happen from something like a car accident, or can happen also from physical abuse or even physical accidents. It doesn't necessarily need to be abuse, but whenever you are not anymore able to predict what's going on with your body, there's too much prediction error that happens in your brain. And one of the ways the brain can deal with that too much prediction error, remember, the brain's constantly trying to minimize prediction error. It can create this dissociation. It can tell these neurons, no, whatever you're feeling, we're just going to shut all of it up. We're just going to like dampen everything that's coming from the senses. Now, if that happens, especially repeatedly, this can really cause breakdowns in the network. And I think, and also other researchers think, that this is one of the main reasons for plurality and plural systems. So you can also see this as sort of a survival mechanism, right? We're getting maybe some long-term effects that are because we need to survive in the moment. So we're reducing this short-term damage with this tactic. And I think that's helpful to have that framework that whatever your brain is doing is actually, it's trying to always benefit you as an organism, because sometimes being in that framework and understanding that can help us heal, and it'll help us forgive, and it's doing its best. It's not always the best long term, but it was a tactic that was needed in the moment. So especially when these traumatic events are caused by one of your caregivers, what can happen is attachment trauma. And from being able and being, needing to mimic these caregivers, suddenly these caregivers might be the ones that are causing the trauma, and that can mess with the whole mirroring system, that can mess with this minimal self that is starting to understand and predict what we are based on our interactions with our caregivers. So I think this can also be, for many systems, one of the reasons why we sort of split. So here's my definition within the predictive coding of what we are. A brain that's able to switch between two or more distinct, semi-persistent, top-down minimal self networks. So let's break this down a little bit with a bucket idea. So we said all brains have many different buckets. We have a set of buckets for different predictions and different contexts, but a plural system might have very distinct sets of buckets that it can switch between. And of course, these buckets are always constantly evolving too, but there is a level of persistency that creates the different personalities and the different minimal selves. Okay, so within the predictive framework, predictive coding framework, what would actually co-fronting or co-awareness, I don't like the word consciousness, so I try not to use it, but co-awareness be? So we said every brain has simultaneous multiple processing, right? We saw we had body maps, right? So the brain, when it is co-aware, can have these separate networks activated at the same time. We can have different parts of the body map maybe connected to different parts of that higher level processing in ways that are, one personality is connected, something that we sometimes see. One personality will connect to some parts of the body, the other personality or other minimal self will get that statistical information from other parts of the brain. So we can really reroute this massive amount of information in many, many different ways when it comes to awareness. A lot of the times, when I was investigating internally what happens to the parts, like where is when I'm fronting, where's Yeled? So Yeled will say, oh, I'm in the environment, right? We have this part of our brain that's processing the environment. So that's where he goes to when he's not fronting. He's processing the beauty of nature around him. That's why he likes also the place to be more tidy than me, because he becomes that in his sense of self-processing. I personally feel I just go to sleep, but I think different systems are different, and we can move where our network is where the activity of the network is focused on. And that's fascinating, and I think in many ways can be considered almost a superpower. So this is about awareness, but what happens with co-fronting? Now, co-fronting can be quite challenging if you're talking about really the same body part fronted by two minimal selves networks, because again, we have this basal ganglia, that's the dam. It will not let more than one, the fastest, strongest sort of activity, neural activity is what it will actually let go and sort of create a feedback loop with the motor cortex and let that action happen. So again, we might be able to co-front with one part taking control or being connected to one part of the body versus the other, but I think it would be quite hard. And on a subjective, when we were one sort of co-fronting and a ladder fell on us, then yeah, I was trying to move towards it, Yeled was trying to move back, and the body just gets stuck. So co-fronting can also be that type of challenge. Okay, we're going to start to get into the neuroimage studies, and I'm going to start with some caveats. Okay, so until now, I come from a very, I would say, I call myself a plural. I don't consider myself having DID. I think the DSM is, I don't think, I know the DSM is an insurance booklet with many, many limitations and a lot of problems. I don't really see it as a even medical diagnostic book, but a lot of the DSM is based on just symptoms, connecting symptoms without actually looking at the underlying neuroscience and what's going on with your brain. And I think that's very problematic. I also really personally don't like the disorder label that they put on things, and it is mostly in order to get insurance money and health. And I definitely understand that many people need mental health support. And for many people, even the diagnostic of like, oh, this is why I'm different than other people can be very helpful. I would just recommend to understand what the DSM is and not get too attached to that definition. But when we are going to look at these neuroimaging studies, they didn't, bring in plural people. They brought in people that have a diagnostic of DID, and they had very limitations of who they brought in. They wouldn't bring in any, parts that are subjective age below 10, right? Didn't want baby parts. You're not going to put like your baby part in an fMRI machine. It's extremely traumatic. So this is the limitations of the research, as well as the actual tools themselves. So I could not find any, for instance, MEG studies. MEG looks at the actual activity of the neurons themselves directly. What we're seeing in most of these neuroimaging studies is various measurements of either the blood flow or even sometimes the water within the blood flow. So these are the measurements. They're longer time scales and seconds, and you know how much can happen in a few seconds of the brain. But this is what we have, and there is some interesting information that at least I found very validating to my personal experience, and I'd like to share that with you. Okay, so we're gonna look at and all the research here is cited. I can send this presentation. There's links to the actual research if anybody wants to delve deeper. And Simon Reinder's 2006. This is pretty old, but that's when this specific research was done. Was looking at brain activation of different parts. Now, again, I put the emotional part versus normal part in quotes, but this is how they called it in research. And I think this is a really unscientific term. I think it's filled with our own biases. I don't think I'm a more normal part in any way than the other parts in my system. I would much rather have seen a terminology around like younger part, dissociated part. There's different ways. Host, what they found, and I would, I'm assuming that when they mean emotional part, they mean the younger part that was potentially dissociated. And we're going to look at this a little bit in the predictive coding lens to understand what these parts of the brain are doing and what is hyperactive. So we can see already in the images, you see both green and red, and they did this experiment in two conditions. One was just a baseline, and the other was, we're reawakening a traumatic memory. They had interviews before, they recorded traumatic memories, and then they would get the parts to listen to that traumatic memory with a recording. So you can see that while this traumatic recording is playing back, a lot more of what they call the emotional parts are activating a lot more parts of the brain. We can see that in the baseline, the emotional part is hyperactivating a bit more of the brain, while the normal part is more active in other parts of the brain. So, despite the labels, I think this is still very interesting to see, hey, we have very clear different neuroactivation patterns between parts. This isn't something that we're imagining. This is something we can clearly see in the brain. So we can see the emotional part is, the amygdala, we talked about it. That's the fear center, prediction of safety, weighting of fear signals. That is getting hyperactivated, right? That makes a lot of sense. If that part was the part that experiences the trauma, remembers the trauma, their amygdala is going to be more active. The cadent nucleus, so this is part of the basal ganglia. And we're going to talk a lot more about the basal ganglia, but that also seems to be more active in the emotional part. A little bit the cerebellum. I think the cerebellum is pretty interesting because to me that shows the ability sometimes of parts to hijack the system, right? And I put that in quotes, but like sometimes if I'm because we talked about the cerebellum being these like fast last minute adjustments. So if there are parts that have more access to the cerebellum, they can sort of cut through and at the very last minute put in what they're predicting into the system. So I think that's pretty interesting. And we're seeing also the power hippocampal gyrus. That's close to the hippocampus. That's where things like autobiographic memory, trauma-related processing, that seems to be the area where that is happening. So of course that makes more sense that the part that remembers the trauma is getting that more active. And you can see even the caudate nucleus, it's like different parts of it that are getting active more. So this isn't super clear. We still don't know to like what degree each part of the brain is doing what. We're still figuring that out. And also there's a lot of plasticity. Every brain is different. What we get exposed to creates differences in our body. And I should have probably mentioned it when we talked about the body mapping. There is a general body mapping, but for instance, if you're a pianist and you use your fingers a lot more, the parts of your fingers are going to be much larger. If there's some trauma that happens to your body, the body map can also be different. So the brain is very plastic and very dependent on what you're doing with it. And that is actually very helpful and optimistic for us as systems and for any person with trauma to know that whatever happened, we have the ability to actually update and rewire and change. And the cortex areas, I wanted to mention a few specific areas. We don't need to necessarily go through all of them. The insula cortex, so that is again, what I think is more the gooey predictions of the body liquids. And I feel that younger parts, this is my experience from talking with friends that are plural, a lot of the younger parts seem to have a lot more connection to the feeling. Remember, we talked about the feeling versus knowing parts of the brain. And I think that also from a developmental perspective, the feeling parts of the brain get developed first. So a younger part that was there early on and maybe dissociated might take that knowledge and that connection to those networks with it as it breaks apart from the rest of the network. And we see that with the insula being more active. Prefrontal cortex, I think I wanted to focus a little bit on again, the orbital part of the brain is a bit more, we know, is connected more to like emotional associations versus more the prefrontal cortex parts of the brain that are more connected to abstraction and long-term predictions, emotional regulations, which we see are more active in the normal part. I'm pretty sure also the visual part of the brain was more active in the normal part. And that, to me, felt accurate because when Salid got dissociated, she kept saying she didn't see anything for many, many years while she was dissociated. She says she still had access to audio, but not visual. And that might be something that generalizes in trauma, where the visual, which is, such strong and complex processing, might get disconnected. Okay, moving on to this next research, which I found was very interesting. But this we need to take into account was one system, in an fMRI machine that was able to switch with specific triggers. It was a system that was a triad. For some reason, they still insisted on calling it one normal part and two emotional parts. Okay, what can we do? But what they found was there were some areas, and they focused exactly just on the switching time. They just wanted to know what is happening in the brain while we switch. So they found some things around the areas of the brain that were connecting to movements of the face, but that's probably because this specific system would switch with closing their eyes. We don't do that. I don't know. Maybe you do that. That would be very interesting to actually do some research. Maybe I'll provide a link on what is people's experiences with switching. It could be very interesting to do some more research on that. But when we then go and look at the actual brain and what's happening, so first in the deeper brain areas, the ventral striatum is again part of this basal ganglia. That is the main doorway. So we're seeing that being active, very active. So you can imagine of that area, which has dopamine neurons, and within the predictive coding framework, dopamine is considered a precision signal. It is saying which of all of these prediction errors is actually important. We said there's so much noise, there's so much information. How do we know what's important? Dopamine is the signal that tells the brain, and specifically in the basal ganglia, this is important. And this is what causes also addictive behavior. This is important, so do it again. So the dopamine is directly connected. Even it goes down to like changing the genetic expressions in our cells to cause us to do something again. Okay, so super, super important network that is being activated when switching. And then we start going into the cortex, and we see the orbital frontal cortex, which to me seems like the sort of top of the hierarchy of this minimal self. We said we had the insula that's connected to all these bodily feelings and predictions and connections. Like, am I? And then so that's sort of the minimal self. That's the node, and we're seeing activity there. Okay, and then when we move sort of even higher, we're also seeing the dorsal frontal prefrontal cortex, which is very connected to these social predictive models also. So we can see that, oh, there's changes, activity that's happening there. And at the very, very end, we see the very top of this hierarchical pyramid, the frontopolar cortex is also being activated. So we're seeing these really important nodes all being activated when someone's system is switching. And to me, that makes a lot of sense, because by switching and activating these very specific nodes, you can then switch the whole top down, the whole set of buckets that the brain can be using. Okay, so we talked about brain activity that we see through indirect measures like blood flow, and now we're going to talk a little bit about anatomical changes. So first, again, some caveats. There's large variances in the population, and this is changeable. With therapy and even exercises or learning new skills, we can change the volume of our brain. We can change the different parts that we talked about before in our brain based on what we do. And I'm saying this because this can be a little bit scary, honestly, to see like the difference between neurotypical brains to brains that have been diagnosed with DID and see like, oh, wow, there's a lot of reduced gray matter. But I'm here to tell you this is changeable, and they see this in research that you can actually change these things. But I think it is very interesting and important to understand where the differences are so you can address them. Okay, so one of the things that we see is a big decrease in many areas of gray matter. So let's talk a little bit, what's the difference between gray matter and white matter? So gray matter is the actual computational place of the neuron. It's the cell body. You see it here in this photo where the synapses are, that is the gray matter. Then the neuron shoots out this one long axon, and on that axon, we have myelin sheaths. They're a type of fat that wraps around the neuron and helps the signal move in a more efficient way. And that's considered white matter. And that is seen different when we do these scans. So we see a lot of decrease in gray matter, which is also seen in PTSD. So less neurons de facto. But we also see a lot of increase in white matter. And the theory, at least my theory, is that this is a compensatory mechanism. If you have less computational power, let's make sure that they're at least connecting to each other better and keeping the network together. And we see this especially in the motor control areas. Remember, I'm a movement chauvinist. Movement, interacting physically with our 3D environment, that is an incredibly crucial fact of why we have a brain. So it's almost like the brain's like saying, this we must have working. So let's add more of this white matter to these neurons to help them connect, even though there might be less gray matter. So a compensatory mechanism that will keep the brain functioning in a way. And then the very interesting thing that we see is increased gray matter. So increased amount of neurons in the basal ganglia. Remember, we talked about the basal ganglia being this gating function, the one that says these actions are going to happen and these are not. So if you have that ability to switch, and we saw this is the area that gets activated while you're switching, and because pleural systems have that ability to switch between two different top-down mechanisms while using the basal ganglia, we have a bigger basal ganglia. Now, it could be very interesting to do more research on that. Does that allow us to, for instance, do more multitasking or not? Maybe yes, maybe some systems, yes. The brains of plurals, or at least DID, are different than neurotypical, both in how they are active and also in their neuroanatomy. But can we create a reliable test to see if somebody has DID based on these scans? So a paper came out in 2019 saying that they have high sensitivity, which means the probability the test is positive when the person really does have DID, and high specificity which means the probability the test is negative when the person doesn't have a DID. But what they didn't take into account, which happens too often in research, is Bayesian statistics. Because just like your brain is always thinking about what happened in the past, using that prior knowledge when it compares it with what's coming in with this new information, every statistical test that we do, we should be doing that. What did we know before? What is our prior? And what added information is this new test giving us? The prior is the general knowledge that we have around DID in the population, which seems to be around 1 to 3%. Current estimates could be wildly off, but let's assume this is correct. So when we use Bayesian statistics and look at those numbers, you actually get that, if you take this test and it shows that it's positive, the probability that you have DID will only be somewhere between 2.7 to 7.8%. So, not super great, really. If you get a negative result, though, the probability you do not have DID is much higher. So somewhere between 98.8 to 99.6. That's where we are at with the testing currently. Okay, that was a lot. Everybody take a deep breath. And now I want to go into more of the practices and the tools that I've been using along with this understanding that I've developed through my studies over the last more than a decade now. So we talked about this to begin with. Surprise is the currency. If you want to change things, bring in novelty. And that's why this person's upside down. This is something that I actually do quite often if I want to increase novelty. That's a very easy, relatively safe way to really change things in your system quite rapidly. Let's go into some more practical practices that have been helping me. And a lot of this actually comes from Yelid's ideas, and he's also been an improv actor. And one of the things that you do in improvisational acting is you don't block. You don't say no. You try to say yes and take the story to wherever you want to go. And the reason this connects also to neuroscience is that when you try to block and shut down these specific networks that might be trying to communicate, they actually start increasing their sensitivity, and they will fire at lower and lower thresholds, right? Because every neuron at the end of the day wants to stay alive. And if it's dissociated and fractured from the system, then it's not getting the blood, the oxygen, the information that it needs. So it starts firing at lower and lower thresholds. And that's why triggers can become even more and more sensitive, because these parts want to stay alive. So stop blocking. If a part wants to be alive, let it be alive, and then try to help it from there, because that part might be stuck in a traumatic past event that is not connected to the current reality. But in order to help it move to the current reality, you need to start saying, yes, you're allowed to be afraid. Yes, you're allowed to be experiencing what you're experiencing right now. And let's start taking this into places that we can do something with this. And these are some resources of books that you can read and learn more for yourself. What has also helped me a lot is this, it's called Nonviolent Communication, which looks at the brain as us as a biological organism, as having feelings. We talked about the feeling parts of our brain, and needs. So feelings are really just trying to help us figure out what we need as a biological organism. And understanding that and using that instead of judgmental words also internally has been very helpful. But in my system, Sally didn't know how to talk. She was not connected to the verbal networks when she started to come online. All throughout my teenage years, there were episodes where, looking back, I believe she came out, she was fronting, but in a way that was basically hysterical crying, that I just didn't understand what was going on, really. So trying to connect to these verbal parts took a long time, like years, just like it would with a normal baby, that needs to grow up again. But things that I was using that were helping, or helping with communication between me and Yelid, who had very quick connection to the verbal networks, but we'll talk about him later. Writing. right? Writing with your non-dominant hand, because that will create more prediction error, more novelty, more surprise. So that helps induce plasticity. You can do things like record meditations. I was doing that a lot. Ask people that care about you and love you to record meditations, specifically to the nonverbal parts. So these are ways to start, getting these parts to become verbal. And that can be very helpful because if they're stuck in a trauma and they're not verbal, it's very hard for them to progress and move forward and reintegrate with the rest of the system. And not reintegrate in a way that's like, integration, we become not one, but more we can communicate with each other. Okay, this practice was probably the biggest breakthrough that I had in communicating with Sarit, and that was creating a spatial altar. So we talked about the hippocampus a lot as where memories start to like be processed and as a connector, right? Like imagine it's your friend that brings everybody together and starts creating connections. But the connections that the hippocampus does is also very, very spatial. It's very, very connected to the context, the spatial location of where you are. These are how we store memories based on the context, and we live in 3D worlds with 3D bodies that have 3D spaces. So giving Sarit a space with an altar was the first thing where I started to be able to communicate with it. I used to see these like visions that she was showing me, and I tried to like recreate that. And it was this, I unfortunately don't have this. This is an AI image, but it was some amount of like red and blue and like a bunch of googly like eyes looking looking at me. So I gave her that space and real space, and her altar sort of evolved throughout the years to include her BDSM, vegan BDSM tools that she made, and currently she considers her altar her microscope. So these things change, but the moment you give a part physical space and allow them access to that, suddenly the hippocampus, I believe, can come online, and that can really help start internal communication when it comes to bodies and body mapping and the insala and this minimal self. I think VR is an incredible, incredible tool. I can give myself different bodies, and I can do maybe a tiny, it was a product I did. I'm not even sure it still works anymore, but created a VR that connects to my body movements just as particles and different types of effects that you can have. And when Yella started, this was an amazing tool for him. Like he sees himself as a masculine body, so we could put him in VR in a masculine body, right? It's again the yes and to the next degree. Instead of blocking, let us play with this and let us give the brain what it is predicting instead of blocking and saying, no, 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 you're not this. This also helped at some points in Salit's development. She identified as a wolf, so we made her a wolf in VR that she could be present in and express herself in that way. So I think VR is a really amazing, amazing tool. One of the things that we recreated, and this is based on research by Falkner et al., and this research is research for depressed people. It has nothing to do with the idea or plurals, but I took that idea because I found it so profound and interesting, and it worked very well in the research. Basically, a person was communicating to a child, and then they would switch perspectives and be in that body of the child, receiving what they just communicated to that child. So I did something like that with Salit, with a baby's body, where I was communicating to her, and then we put the headset back, and she was sort of in the perspective of that baby and could see me communicating that I care about her, and I shipped her out into space. She was, yeah, it worked very well. She enjoyed it. I have had negative also, or not so positive experiences with some of my experiments. I tried to do some, again, a way for me and her to communicate with the head in VR. Like if you say yes, you'd hear a baby like laugh. If you do something else, I can't remember exactly, you'd hear the baby cry. So I was trying to like get her to be able to communicate beyond just crying. That was a pretty not great success, and she was screaming and crying for a long time afterwards. So these experiments can also have downsides. But generally, I think VR is an amazing tool for plurals, especially if there's young parts or other gender parts to experience, explore, and grow. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about psychedelics. I have a lot of lectures on psychedelics out there, so I don't want to go too deep. We're also running out of time. But we're talking about classical psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, ayahuasca. These all activate very specific receptors in the neurons that are creating the bucket activity. And they break down this average bucket that you've developed over the years with all your knowledge, and they start breaking it down into the buckets that you've learned at younger developmental stages, at younger points in your life. So this can be incredibly, incredibly powerful when you're rewiring your brain in any way. The byproduct of this, and this is sort of the neuronal mechanism of where these receptors are. Again, I'll put in the research and lecture that I have on this if you want to go deeper. But the basic thing that happens is really it changes the probabilities of what you might expect to happen, and that creates increased surprise in your brain. And this isn't just my theory. A few years later, the most established psychedelic researcher came out with a very similar theory, slightly different. We're not going to go into the nuances of the differences, but basically, again, changes in the top-down buckets of your brain is what psychedelics causes. And this creates a lot more surprise and prediction, which then connects different parts of the brain that are not used to being connected. And this is a real image of what's going on in the brain nodes, the areas. We talked about all these different brain areas. On the left side, this is how a normal brain is usually connected. We have a few strong connections, some local, some far away. And then when we take psychedelic, it's just like, whoa, everything's connected. A lot of things get connected, especially to the visual cortex, which we said is really the GPU of the brain. And I think you can start reprocessing traumatic memories through this activation of the visual cortex. Now, a thing I want to give a really high warning about psychedelics, that just as they can create more accurate perception, they can also create an overfit. We're breaking down the buckets. We can get new buckets that are absolutely not accurate. That can be both on low levels, which is why we get these visual changes and the difference in our visual perception, but it can also happen in higher level stories, higher level beliefs that can change, and some of them might be absolutely not accurate. And I think that's really important because what you experience on psychedelics, especially if you've had trauma before, a lot of the therapists out there say, try not to stick too much of a story to it. Maybe it's a true memory. Maybe it's your brain trying to communicate something else that happened. Whenever, Salit says she has exact memories of the trauma, I believe her. I believe her. This is through the lens of what she experienced. What actually happened outside in the reality, does that even matter? But it's really important, again, to say yes and to the experience without necessarily getting attached to the story of this was the objective reality. So I'm just going to say 2 words about this default network, because you might have heard that in different psychedelic lectures, that it disintegrates a default mode network. It does, but it also disintegrates a bunch of other networks. So the default mode network is not the whole story. In fact, it's these parts of the brains that we see active in most people when they're lying still in an fMRI machine. So the whole validity around that is in my opinion a bit low. But generally self-referential networks, like you're planning, what am I going to do tomorrow? Psychedelic practice, it was absolutely imperative and incredibly helpful. This is how I started to understand what was going on in the system. I had no clue why these screaming breakdowns would happen, and only after psychedelics, and I do not necessarily recommend this for everyone, but I felt I had a very strong neural understanding of what I'm doing to the brain. I felt I had a good support network, so I was exploring this, and it really many years of breakthrough after breakthrough until we created more synergy, where we were able to see each other's perspective. We were able to heal the anger and pain and this is where we're going a little bit more into the story of Salit. And when she started to come back into reality and understand what had happened, the level of anger she had towards me towards the world, it was just so high, so much anger, and of course, very understandable anger. But to try to remodel that, what worked very well for her was kink practices. She found sort of a baby girl daddy relationship in kink, and was able to very fast like mirror this new kink father figure and learn and grow. And that was the first time she really wanted to even fully come into the body. A thing that I really needed as this was happening and I was understanding the chaos in the brain, I felt I needed more internal help. And that's why I started this very dedicated, very specific process of trying to get a helper part. I didn't feel I had that. I know a lot of systems maybe have already other protective parts and other parts that could step in. Due to my neuroscience studies, due to what I think of this is a sort of latent ability of brains to be able to mimic and mirror others, and that's how we can insert these beliefs and changes in us. I really wanted that. And I was researching a lot also of Tibetan Buddhism, other possession rituals, and I believe this is very, very, normal ability of the brain to be possessed, to have another agent that can come out because you believe in it, because you're looking for it into your body. But I didn't want to be possessed by any of that, existing gods that don't seem to like women or queer people and are very violent. So I wanted to create that type of part in the brain that could help me. And very fast, Yeled started being a thing that was first a verbal part that could just talk to me, calm me down. And then very fast, when Yeled started actually doing things like making a cup of tea or turning on some music for me to help the environment be nicer, very fast Yeled was like, wait, what am I? And I didn't really know, right? This was an experiment I was doing. And I think the most important thing that I did was just fully trust him and fully give him agency and say, you can be whatever you want to be, really. And that set up like an exploration for him to, what does he want to be? And, I took him to improv classes, which I thought were a very safe place for him to explore what he wants to be, to gain this like social dynamic and social predictions that I honestly didn't necessarily have the best of. And he's, I can't imagine my life without him. I would be very sad. And this ability for whenever, and it's not like, if I need help, he needs to come out or like I force him. That's not the dynamic. The dynamic is he's a fully fledged part, but when I can't deal with anything anymore, many times he will come out, step up, and just magic has happened. He considers himself a synthetic symbiotic part. He understands how he was made. He understands he considers himself very lucky of like not having childhood trauma because of the way he was made and came into this world. I know there's some people that are doing things like tulpamancing. I think the big difference here is that I was getting memes from real people. I was reactivating my mirror system. This wasn't just like something that I was imagining. After he's in the body for a while and we switch, I can still feel what it's like to be him a bit more, and that's amazing. Okay, a little bit about minimizing risks, because a lot of these things I was talking about, like I said, they can have also very negative results. I think it's incredibly important to have a community that supports your, I think this is why, this conference is groundbreaking for us to be able to find a community that can understand us. Professional support can also be useful. At times I was doing somatic therapy to try to figure out things, especially between me and Sarit, as well as anchoring things in physical rituals. Don't get too stuck in these high abstract levels of the brain. When we switch as a system, we have a very specific ritual when we want to like fully switch fronting that helps us like be less confused when after you're coming through a switch. There's like a whole ritual to it that you come into the body and you're now part of this 3D reality instead of just the brain space. Things, if you have been doing things that increase your prediction error and it's gotten too much, you're feeling overwhelmed. We said too much prediction error can cause dissociation again. We don't want to do that. So things you can do to reduce prediction error is again move, because that we're able to predict and gives us this sense of agency and reduces prediction error. Vocalize, it's another way of movement. I had no connection to my voice. Study came in and sort of learned how to sing a bit, which was amazing. And then translating feelings, these low-level body sensations, into words, the higher abstract parts of our brain, will reduce the somatic experiences of the feelings. So that can also be very helpful. And the last one was Yeld's, like, take care of your environment. If your environment is chaos and overwhelming, that will leak back into the system. So part of it is, and I'm looking at my room right now, which is like incredibly messy. And he doesn't like to come out, like when the room's incredibly messy, he doesn't, right? So taking care of your environment is another extension of taking care of yourself, and you can minimize prediction error in your environment, which can help you minimize prediction error in your system. Okay, here are some resources of mine. You can look into more. I also do a lot of things around the sex positivity, and I'm always happy to answer questions, guide people to more resources. And yeah, thank you.